to have the stage and introduce himself and quite a biography. So talk about for amphibians, reptiles, and oh my.
Yeah, what this is about, I'm the state herpetologist. Can I sit here or do I have to stand up?
If you at least move to the middle, then people in the back can hear you. Can you just move your chair to the middle?
Well, I guess so, but I have to aim this thing.
Where you want it.
Otherwise, he's talking over to this.
I guess I can lean on it.
Split the difference?
Okay. I'm the state herpetologist. I work for Kentucky Fish and Wildlife. I've been the state herpetologist since 2003. One of these years I'm going to retire, but right now we're working on an update of the state wildlife action plan, and we have identified a bunch of herps as being kind of in trouble in the state for one reason or another. So if the funding, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act passes Congress, Kentucky Fish and Wildlife will all of a sudden have millions of dollars to spend on amphibians and reptiles, which will be pretty cool. Unfortunately, I probably won't be around for it, but anyway, what I was going to do is go through the species that we're looking at now that for one reason or another they are on our list of species of greatest conservation need. And do I need to dim the lights or does this work okay in here?
No, it's fine. Back here anyway.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
good.
I need to figure out how to change this.
The right arrow, the arrow on the right.
Where do I aim it?
Where does he aim
Maybe the
it?
remote's not.
Oh, you shouldn't have to aim. Oh! Yep, if I plug the receiver in. it would-
Oh, okay, thank you.
That's it, maybe the remote's not.
Yeah, here.
I thought, well, it's like everything else, except it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Just like
Now it'll work.
just like state government.
Try that. Yeah.
Okay. So here are some reasons why some of these species are on our list of species of greatest conservation need. Some are in really big trouble. Either they're really rare in the state or they're declining, and I'm not going to read this to you. There's others that are showing declines in part of their range in the state, and then some things are just hard to find. And you know, I've lived in Kentucky since 1971, and I have never found a live scarlet snake. Never. I found one run over one that ran between the lakes. So, and we have like 21 county records for that species. So that's what I call hard to find. I think that's the only Kentucky reptile that I have never found in the state. Then there are some that have really limited ranges, quite a few here. And I guess when I say we, I mean me. It's where I go out and look for them and track them, they seem to be doing pretty well. I used to have a compadre in this sort of thing, Brainerd Palmer Ball, who worked for the Nature Preserves Commission, did a lot of herp work also, and he and I worked together a lot. Then he up and retired in like 2005 or so. He still goes out and does stuff, but I said, Brainerd, why are you retiring? You know, you're going to go out and go birding and get paid for it, or just do it on your own time. He wanted to retire, so he did. And I've got a pretty big list of species that seem to be doing okay in the state, but for various reasons that are on our list, like the timber rattlesnake, which is widely distributed in Kentucky, but it's being hit pretty hard by snake fungal disease in the Northeast. And so we're keeping our eye on timber rattlesnakes. You know, other species like the eastern spadefoot, which is widespread in the state, but it's susceptible to chytrid fungus. I mean, there are a lot of diseases now that are affecting amphibians and reptiles. And then some of these things they're just hard to find, so they're on our list. So I'm gonna kind of go through, I'm gonna start with frogs. 8 different kinds of frogs that are on our list. And you get to see every one of them. Now, the one on the left is a Blanchard's cricket frog. And up until 2008, we just had one kind of cricket frog in the state, the northern cricket frog. Blanchard's cricket frog was north of the Ohio River. But I made the mistake of contributing some cricket frogs to a guy doing a range-wide genetic study. And the ones I sent him from Carroll County turned out to be Blanchard's cricket frog. So they were on the wrong side of the Ohio River. The only way to identify them is molecular.
Wow.
The calls are the same, the appearance is the same. We have no way of knowing whether there's just one place in the state that has Blanchard's cricket frogs, or whether it could be all the cricket frogs in the Kentucky River drainage and east. We have no way of knowing. So we're going to need to fund somebody in a university to take toe clips from the cricket frogs and figure it out. This is a barking tree frog. These are only in the Pennywile, and they're only known from 8 counties. They seem to be doing okay, but the places where they breed are sinkhole ponds. And it's sinkhole ponds in agricultural fields. That's the only place we have ever found barking tree frogs in the state. They don't live in the woods. We have no idea where the adults are when they're away from the ponds. They may be birds. We just don't know. But so here are a couple of barking tree frogs calling from a site called Maple Lakes out in western Kentucky. And barking tree frogs, sometimes they're spotted, sometimes they're not. One frog can be spotted one day and plain green the next day. So it's kind of neat. Tree frogs are kind of like this.
Do they bark?
Actually, they do. They have 2 different calls, a barking call and then something that sounds more like, almost like a green tree frog, which I'm sure means nothing to most of you. But the barking call is a call they make when they're floating in the water. And the other call is a call that they make when they're up in a bush. And so when I went to that place where I got the photos of the frogs calling, I thought, man, we've got 2 different kinds of barking tree frogs. Because some are barking and some are not. And then it took me a couple hours, but I figured out, okay, the ones floating in the water sound one way, the ones up in the button bush sound totally different. So
So
that
they
was
have a
pretty
spring
cool.
call and a summer call?
They just call when they're breeding. So I don't know what you mean by a summer call. They breed from
I
like
thought when they
mid-May
moved
till.
up into the woods in the summer, maybe.
Well, you know, the ponds that they breed in, and this is one of them. And this pond's in Caldwell County, and it fills up with water after a big rain, and it holds water sometimes for a month, sometimes for 2 months, and then it goes dry. But we have looked in the woods and can't find the adults. And most of these ponds are half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from the woods. Now, how's a chunky tree frog going to travel through a cornfield or a wheat field 3/4 of a mile to get to a sinkhole pond and be there for a few weeks and call and then go back to the woods? It's just not going to happen. We just don't know what they do. So this is the bird voice tree frog. These are pretty common over at Slew's Wildlife Area. If any of you have ever been over there in the summertime, they have a really beautiful bird-like chirping call. Bird voice tree frogs are extremely variable in color. I get a lot, people send me photos of tree frogs all the time. I found a bird voice tree frog on my garage in Lexington, you know. Well, no, you didn't. You found a Cope's gray tree frog, but gray tree frogs, Cope's gray tree frogs, and bird voice tree frogs all look alike. The only way to tell the bird voiced is by the color inside the thigh. On the inside of the thigh, it's greenish, and it's yellow on the other two. But the gray and the Cope's gray, you can only tell those apart by the call of the male, or by DNA work. So, tree frog, you can't identify a tree frog by looking at it. Now here are two gray tree frogs. This is the rare gray tree frog. And it's a tetraploid, which means it has 4 sets of chromosomes.
Wow.
Now the common gray tree frog that's around here is Cope's gray tree frog, and it's a diploid. So it only has 2 sets of chromosomes. But there's no way you can tell that by looking at it. But you can identify them by the voice. And these, like all gray tree frogs, they can change color. They can be almost black, almost white, gray, green, with or without a splotch. So, endlessly fascinating. One of the neatest frogs in the state is the crawfish frog. And this is a big frog. I mean, we're talking like that. And the adults live in crayfish burrows. One crawfish frog will spend basically its whole life in one crayfish burrow in a field somewhere. And in February or March, when the weather's right, it'll come out and leave that burrow and travel to a breeding pond, which may be as far as a mile away. And it'll be in that pond for two weeks or so, mate, lay eggs. It returns to the exact same crayfish burrow. I mean, how they do that, nobody knows. But these are gorgeous frogs, and only rarely do you get a chance to actually see live ones. You have to hit the night when they're migrating. It'll be a rainy night. And sometimes I might see 40 or 50 in a night if I'm out there on the right night. This year, I was out at West Kentucky Wildlife Area in MacGregir County, and they were calling, but they'd already traveled to the pond, so I didn't see a single one. Now this kind of shows you what's happened with crawfish frogs. They're disappearing. So the historical map is on the left. Since 2010 is on the right. They have disappeared from the southern Jackson Purchase, and they've disappeared from parts of the western coalfield. And there's an old record from Davis County. Actually, Joe Ford told me he had seen them in another place. So they were, if we count that, 2 sites in Davis County. But they haven't been seen in Davis County since before 1960. There is a site in Henderson County, not far from the line, where I found a population a few years ago, and they're still there. These are crawfish frog ponds, breeding ponds. The one right by the road is an excellent pond. It always has a lot of them, but it's right next to the road. So you can imagine what happens on a rainy night. You get this. And that is kind of disgusting. And I see a lot of these things run over. And when you have a good migrating night, you can't move Kentucky 358. It's a state highway. It's too bad the pond is there, but that pond is a really good breeding site. It produces lots of crawfish frogs, and it seems to more than make up for the casualties. And then this is a group calling. I have never gotten a picture like this. A friend of mine, Todd McKinney, stood in the dark for like half an hour and got this photograph. He just kind of aimed his camera at the pond, and when they started calling, fired his flash, and that's what he got. You know. I had tried and tried. I tried this year and walked up over the berm of the pond, you know, and they were calling really well. I thought, oh, this is my chance. As soon as I appeared on the horizon, they all shut up. And then they dived to the bottom of the pond. So I really appreciate it when somebody gets a photo like that. Here's a pair mating. And the tadpole is pretty distinctive as tadpoles go, and it's big. And here at West Kentucky Wildlife Management Area, there are lots of crawfish frogs. So you can kind of look at the whole life history there. Here's a newly transformed one. And here's one on the left, and that's a little baby southern leopard frog on the right. So pretty similar to a leopard frog, but the eyes are different, the spotting is different. To me, they're way different. kind of like a black-throated green and a black-throated blue. Word was. Another frog that's in a lot of trouble in the state is the northern leopard frog. Now, you don't have those around here, you have southern leopard frogs, but the northern leopard frog is kind of chunkier. It usually has a dark spot on the snout in front of the eyes. And it's in the bluegrass region in northeastern Kentucky. There's an egg mass and a tadpole, which probably looks just like the last tadpole I showed you. But, you know, we're not going to get into tadpole identification. It takes years. So at Kentucky River Wildlife Area, on the left there, you can see that there's an old drainage ditch. And when I started working there, it was just a drainage ditch. And the leopard frogs would lay eggs in it. And most years, the ditch would go dry, and all the tadpoles would just dry up. So I talked the manager into going out there with a small dozer, a bobcat, and scooping out some holes that would hold water a little bit longer, and that's what you see on the left. So he made 3 of those for me, and it made a world of difference. Most years, the leopard frogs could actually lay their eggs, and the tadpoles would transform. They still went dry a couple of years, but that's part of the price you pay for, you know, breeding in March. Then finally, a few years later, they built me 2 really nice shallow grassy ponds like the one on the right. So they've done really well once we got those things installed up there. So you can do stuff for leopard frogs. This will give you perspective. The northern leopard frog is the big green spot. You can see historically they were all through the bluegrass. Since 2010, they're pretty much just along the Kentucky River bottoms, and then in northeastern Kentucky, they have disappeared from most of the bluegrass. The blue dots are southern leopard frogs. That's a very common widespread species, and they haven't declined at all. So they're doing very well. Spadefoot is a really neat creature. A spadefoot toad is what people call them, but they have that gorgeous elliptical pupil and that big yellow eye. And then on the hind foot, there's a single digging spade. And they set one down on the ground, and it'll shuffle its legs and just go straight down into the dirt. Really neat creatures. Now, regular toads have 2 digging spades. So I get a lot of people who say, I found a spadefoot, you know, it's got spades on its feet. Well, no, it's just an American toad. But spadefoots are pretty unique. They only breed after a big rainstorm, and it can be any time from February through November. They spend most of their time underground, and some populations they might breed once every 5 years. It all depends on when the thunderstorms come. So it's kind of hard to keep up with them. They are really neat.
What do they eat?
All frogs eat pretty much the same thing: insects, earthworms. Now, I've had a spadefoot in captivity that I just would put earthworms in there once a week, and it never came up above the soil, but the earthworms would all disappear. And I had that spadefoot for a couple of years. So apparently they could find them underground and eat them. Now sometimes they actually come out and hop around and feed on things. But, you know, pretty much all amphibians and reptiles are predators. And here's a spadefoot calling. I had gone a long time without hearing a chorus, and I was staying out at Pennyrile Forest State Park one night, and I was getting ready to go out and do some frog surveys, and a tornado came through right after dusk. And so I waited till the tornado was over with, and I went to leave, and I couldn't get out of the park because the trees had fallen across the road, and I was stuck there. But there's a gravel road, loop road, that's a couple of miles long, so I drove that. I found 13 ponds with spadefoots, and no one even knew they were there, you know. And it's pretty neat. So that's where I got that photo, was on that night. And there's a pair mating, and then there's the eggs. The really interesting thing about spadefoots are the tadpoles. The tadpoles swim in these dense schools. And when they're feeding, on the right there, in a pond, the water above the school of tadpoles actually vibrates. And it's really distinctive. So when you know what you're looking for, you can go to, see a pond and you see something like that, you know that that's a school of spadefoot tadpoles. That's kind of how to track the species. This is the Plains leopard frog. It's one of the few frogs I actually found, the first ones in Kentucky, and this was in 2011. And I'm driving down a road in western Fulton County. It's mid-September. It's about 95 degrees. And the last thing I expected to see on the road was a leopard frog, and I thought, okay, a leopard frog. I thought something must have chased it out of the swamp. So I drove up next to it with my GPS, and I thought, well, I'm at least going to get a location on it. And I looked down, and it's not a normal southern leopard frog. If you look at the, is this a pointer?
It won't work on the TV.
Okay. There's a gap in the dorsolateral folds. Really distinctive. Right here on each side. And this one is inset from that one, and that's how you recognize a Plains leopard frog. So that was the first one in the state. So we still only know them from really the lower Hickman bottoms of the western end of Fulton County. But the one on the right there is the very first Plains leopard frog from Kentucky. And that's where I found it. I mean, in the middle of ag fields. And when I go looking for Plains leopard frogs, I look for them during the day. Here's one right here. And as long as you stay in your vehicle, you can drive close enough to get a pretty good look and identify them. The picture on the right, I shot out of the window of my state vehicle. But they come out and sit on the road, and they feed on caterpillars and grasshoppers that are in the soybean fields and the cornfields. And so when they're out in the middle of the road, they can see a caterpillar or a grasshopper a long ways off, and then they'll just take off down the road and get it. It's a pretty neat hunting strategy. Okay, salamanders. Almost half of our salamanders are in some sort of trouble in the state, 47%. And that's kind of a list of them. The one on the right is a normal Jefferson salamander, and it's a bluegrass East Kentucky species. The one on the left is called a unisexual, and it's a population of salamanders. They are all female, and they have genetic material from a Jefferson and a blue spotted salamander, which is something that's found up in Michigan. Apparently what happened during one of the glacial periods is the blue spotted and the Jefferson salamanders were crammed together somehow, and they managed to form these. It's not really a hybrid, it's just the genetics have combined. And so,
Does the legislature know about this?
Yeah, I thought all this
Somebody should know.
they're not allowed, these aren't allowed to be in an elementary school or a library. Yeah. If you take a unisexual to a library,
At least it's not a drag queen.
well, I don't know, look at all the color on it. But, Jefferson salamanders can have a lot of blue on them also. The only way to identify these is by measuring the red blood cells or by looking at DNA. But they're all female. They participate in the courtship of the Jefferson. So it kind of takes the courtship energy from the Jefferson salamander, but they don't actually, they never pick up a spermatophore, they never pick up any genetic material. They just kind of get turned on by the Jefferson, and then they go ahead and they lay their own fertile eggs. So it's pretty cool, for a long time, we knew these from one animal in at Camp Ernst in Boone County. But we now know them from 4 counties in the state. There's a couple of students got interested in them, and so the one on the left there, Andrea Dreyer, who was a grad student at UK, went up and threw a bunch of minnow traps in a pond up at outside of Fort Thomas, and she caught 80-some salamanders in one night. This is like in February of 3 years ago. 75 females, 5 males. So because of the ratio, we knew that it had to be a population of unisexuals. And so that was pretty neat. So the males were all Jefferson, and then there were a few female Jefferson. Everything else was the unisexual. That's pretty cool. This is on the left is a streamside salamander, and on the right is a smallmouth. The smallmouth is what you have around here. They're really common on rainy nights. If you drive the roads in the rain in March, February, March, April, you see a lot of smallmouth salamanders. They breed in ditches and pools in the woods and things. And for a long time, we just had one species in the state, the smallmouth, but the streamside is different. It lays different eggs, and it has a different distribution, and it's actually named after Roger Barber, that's Ambystoma barberi. One of his grad students described it as a new species. So this is what streamside salamander eggs look like. They lay their eggs in one layer under a rock in a creek, or under a piece of wood in a ditch. I found them laid on license plates, in ditches, on cardboard, anything that has a flat surface that's underwater. But and it's really hard to get that photo on the right. You had to dig down in the creek bed and then come up underneath the salamander to get that. Or I could have just put it in an aquarium, but I wouldn't do that. So there's some stream sides, and then there's a larva of the stream side. Another salamander that's similar is a mole salamander. They're really stubby, and they are out pretty much in the Jackson Purchase, and then across the Pennyroyal to Todd and Logan counties. These are really neat. They're hard to find. They're kind of rare, but if you get out there around Keysburg and drive the roads in February, you can find them. Just a stubby, chunky salamander with a short tail and a wide head, long toes. And that's another mole salamander. The eggs are amazing. With salamander eggs, usually you can pick up the egg mass and it kind of stays in your hand. But with mole salamander eggs, it just runs through your hands. It's really amazing. It's like when you have a really bad cold. It's good. And the larvae are really pretty. So the adults aren't much to look at, but the eggs are great and the larvae are beautiful. We have 2 kind of large aquatic salamanders that are kind of rare. The one on the left is an amphibian, which gets about 3 feet long and has 4 tiny legs and no external gills. The one on the left there, I used to work for the highway department, and we were working on the Great River Road project in 1979, and we were sailing at night in a slough along Reelfoot Lake, and we caught it in a minnow seine at night. And the guy on the other end of the seine, he's a Vietnam vet, always, I'm a Marine, this stuff. He took one look at that thing and he threw the pole in the water and he says, I'm out of here. So I grabbed up the seine and the amphibian and everything and hauled it up on the bank, and then they had this big cooler full of beer. When you work for the highway department, things used to be lax. I dumped the whole cooler full of beer on the edge of the road and filled it up with swamp water and put that guy in it. And I had that amphibian until just a couple of years ago. So it was my pet amphibian for like 50 years. It ate crayfish and minnows and mice, and every once in a while a bird gets in your house and I had a light over the aquarium it was in, and a couple of times I walked into the room and there were a bunch of feathers floating, you know, and the amphibian's got like a lump in him. So, I know he ate a cardinal and let's see, what was the other one? I think it was one of the, I think it was a chimney swift. So, and then the thing on the right is a siren. They are actually in Davis County. Joe Ford used to call them sirens. He always had a couple of them in an aquarium at the old museum. But if you know where the Carpenter Lakes are, you can actually go to the Carpenter Lakes and dip around with a dip net, you know, in the leaves and the muck, and you might actually catch one of these. Most of our rare salamanders are plethodontids, they're lungless salamanders. You know, they have no lungs, all their breathing is through their skin. Mississippi slimy salamander, we have two locations for it. I got involved in some DNA projects, studies a long time ago with Dick Heighton at University of Maryland, and he was studying slimy salamanders throughout their range. So I made the mistake of sending him some from various parts of Kentucky, and it turns out, he calls me up and he says, you know, those two you sent me from far western Kentucky, he said they messed up my whole range map because they are the same species that's in Mississippi. So that connected, you know, so that made all the ones in West Tennessee, Mississippi slimy salamanders also. But you cannot tell a northern from a Mississippi slimy by looking at them, just by DNA. This is a species in eastern Kentucky that looks like a slimy salamander, but it's not. It's skinnier, has a skinny tail and a white throat and chin. So this is the Cumberland Plateau salamander. It was thought to not exist as a species, and Dick Heighton and I resurrected it from synonymy because it turned out to be truly unique. It's a unique and ancient species of salamander. So these are pretty common in the Cumberland Mountains. Not doing too well in the rest of eastern Kentucky.
Wow.
But to compare a Cumberland Plateau and a slimy, what we look at, this is a slimy, and this is the Cumberland Plateau. It has a bulgier eyes, it has a flatter head, it has tiny spots, and a normal northern slimy has big spots, and then the tails are different. A northern slimy has spots on the tail, and a Cumberland Plateau doesn't. So you can tell them apart sometimes. This is probably our rarest salamander. This is the yellow-spotted woodland salamander, known from now 8 locations in the Cumberland Mountains. This is one that James Kaiser found during songbird training at Camp O'Cumberland's in Harlan County. So songbird training is good for something anyway. This is from my site along Franks Creek in Letcher County. So this is the only site I actually found by myself, and it's our best site in the state. So you can go down there at night and actually find these. Northern Kentucky has redback salamanders. It's called the most abundant salamander in eastern North America. Kentucky, it's rare. We have a small population in Boone and Kenton in northern Kentucky, and then a small population in Owen County along Eagle Creek. And the ones in Owen County are related to the ones in West Virginia, and the ones in Boone and Kenton are related to the ones across the river in Ohio. I mean, it's hard to explain that, but that's kind of the way it is. Green salamander is an eastern Kentucky rock crevice species, and it's very susceptible to chytrid fungus. These are green salamanders in crevices. They lay eggs on land. All of the salamanders in this small group here, they're not aquatic at all. So there's a green salamander female with her eggs in a sandstone crevice in July. And this is Tracy, who used to work with me in non-game. So she always liked going out on the green salamander surveys, so I could take her with me. So, yeah, we're looking down at Cumberland Falls and looking in the crevices, and she found 3. So that's the signal for how many green salamanders are in the crevices.
3.
In far western Kentucky, we have the 3-lined salamander, which is just known from 2 small populations, one along Blood River and one along Terrapin Creek in the Jackson Purchase. But really unique species, similar to the long-tailed salamander. And there's a larva in a plastic spoon. So those plastic spoons you guys pick up along the side of the road are good for something, you know. I always carry one with me now. And then you can get a pretty good photo of a salamander larva in a plastic spoon for an Oriental restaurant. Then this is a Midland mud. These are, they're not rare, we just can't find them. And maybe they're dropping off, I have no idea. There's a lot of variation across the state. The ones in the western part of the state have little spots on them, and the ones in southeast Kentucky have big spots. I don't know what that means. But Joe Ford once told me that he was camping by a spring, and I think it was somewhere in the Panther Creek drainage, and there were red salamanders in the spring. And I often thought, well, I wonder if he found mud salamanders. Yeah, you're Preston, right?
Yes, John.
Yeah.
John, this looks a whole lot like a Kentucky cave salamander.
It does. Cave salamander's a lot skinnier though, but the coloration's the same. Yeah. When people find a red salamander with black spots, it can be a mud, it can be a cave, it can be a red, or it could be a red after a red spotted newt. So. And they all pretty much look the same to most people. This is a Black Mountain salamander from southeastern Kentucky. This is a species, the only species I think that Roger Barber actually described by himself. From near the top of Black Mountain, and it's our largest dusky salamander. I mean, these are big. They get 7 inches long or so. They're big enough you have to be really good to catch one in one hand. Usually they get away. I use a dip net when I'm trying to catch them. I chase them into a net, which is not fair. But one of my favorite things to do is down in southeastern Kentucky is go out at night and go up on Black Mountain, and you go to the seeps and the springs, and these things all have their heads sticking out of the crevices and the waterfalls. And I like going out and photographing Black Mountain salamander. So those are all shot. But you get about 1 or 2 pictures, and then they back in there, and you go somewhere else, you come back 2 minutes later, and they're sticking back out again. And you can actually catch earthworms and things and feed them. It's kind of fun. On the left is a Black Mountain salamander compared to a northern dusky. Northern duskies have all that white mottling and Black Mountains don't. And on the right, we were out netting bats one night in eastern Kentucky, and we had a bunch of students from Moorhead that were just kind of along for the experience. And so these 2 girls are sitting there, and one of them says, "Hey, these 2 salamanders are fighting." I said, yeah, right. So I go over there, and it's 2 Black Mountain salamanders, and apparently they were in a territorial dispute, and they had a hold of each other by the head, and neither one would let go. It was really neat. So I did get some decent pictures of it. And then I had to make sure that they were both males, which they were, so I had to collect them and then look at their underparts, under a dissecting microscope, and they were both males. It's hard to tell males from females. And these are Allegheny Mountain dusky salamanders, which are really uncommon in eastern Kentucky, but common in the Cumberland Mountains. One of these was found at Carter Cave State Park by a Boy Scout troop in like 1953. And can't remember the name of the place, Box Canyon at Carter Cave State Park. And I bet I've gone there 20 times, never been able to find one. But the specimen was in the old UK collection, and I looked at it several times, and that's what it was. So And these are northern dusky and spotted dusky salamanders. All of our dusky salamanders are in trouble. The northern duskies, I think, have been affected by the plumes, you know, like from the Paradise coal burning power plant. I mean, the northern dusky has disappeared from the Mammoth Cave area where it used to be abundant, and a whole lot of areas around there. Springs that used to be full of duskies now have none. And I think it's probably an acid precipitation issue. But, people are postulating that up in the Northeast also, but no one can prove it. Maybe Kelly Craft can get to the bottom of it. I shouldn't joke about politics. Okay, one of our really neat salamanders is the eastern hellbender. We have an ad in our fishing guide. You know, if you see one, please let us know and send a photo. These are big brown salamanders with folds of skin on their sides, and they live in clean rivers. I don't know how rare they are. Biologists can't find them. We hired a guy from Ohio who's like the Ohio expert on hellbenders. He spent 3 years in Kentucky, and he found them in one place. The way you looked for them back then was you got a log rolling PV, and you get a crew of 5 or 6 people, and you set up a menacing in the river, and then you lift up these great big rocks and try to run the hellbender out. They found one site. But that's really hard on the habitat when you do that, so we do it differently now. We still can't find them. These are photos of hellbenders that fishermen sent me. So fishermen catch half dozen a year and send me the pictures. So their hellbenders are doing okay. We just can't catch them. So the one population we have, which is in eastern Kentucky, we started to work with Purdue University, and we help them collect eggs. Hellbenders breed in the fall, and the males guard the eggs. So the guy from Purdue comes and they collect eggs, take them back to Purdue, hatch them out, raise the young until they're 2 years old, and about that long, and then they're restoring them in Indiana with some of them, and then the other ones we get back, and so we're trying to restore them in northeastern Kentucky.
They're in the Blue River.
Yeah, that's where they're doing the
Yeah,
restoration.
That's where they're doing the work.
Okay, so this is collecting hellbender eggs, which is we do it in October. And then we also, every time we get a hellbender, we put a pit tag in it, we measure it, we weigh it, we swab it, check it for diseases. So these things get hounded a lot if they get caught. Now I'm going to get into snakes. We have, a lot of our snakes are in trouble. And most people don't care for snakes. I love snakes. I've loved snakes since I saw my first one when I was 5 years old. But this is a scarlet snake, and those of you who know Brainerd, when he worked for nature preserves, he caught this scarlet snake at Fort Knox. And I have still never found a live scarlet snake, but he called me up and he said he caught a scarlet snake, did I want to photograph it? Yeah. So he drove from Fort Knox to like Shelbyville, and I met him there and photographed it in the parking lot of there was a motel parking lot. So I brought leaves, I brought rocks, I brought sand, I brought all this habitat. So photographed it, and then Brainerd took it back to Fort Knox and let it go, never to be seen again. So a scarlet snake kind of looks like a coral snake, but it's pure white underneath. Kentucky has no coral snakes. This kind of shows you what's happened to scarlet snakes. We have like 21 county records, but since 2010, we've only found them one was in a swimming pool in Christian County that it fell in, and all the rest have been from Land Between the Lakes. So these things have become really rare, or maybe they're just good at hiding, who knows. This is a scarlet king snake, probably our most beautiful snake. Looks a lot like a coral snake. A big scarlet king snake will be, 1.5 foot long, maybe 2 feet long. These are fairly common in land between the lakes, but they have disappeared everywhere else. And this is, I caught a female a few years ago, and she was gravid, so I kept her. I took her home, she laid eggs, and Will Bird, who works at the Louisville Zoo Herp Aquarium, is really good at hatching out snake eggs, so I gave him the eggs. And so he hatched out the baby scarlet kings, and he photographed one of them hatching. And so after they hatched, I took them back and turned them loose where I caught the female laying between the legs. But, I mean, that's just cute, you know. Doesn't get any cuter than a scarlet king snake with its head sticking out of the egg. And this kind of shows you what's happened to scarlet king snakes. Mammoth cave records, one was 1896, one was 1934. Southeastern Kentucky was in the 60s. All those eastern Kentucky points were 1920s and 1930s. And no one has found one since. I have no idea why. This is a really neat snake. It's called a crown snake. It's a little worm snake looking thing, maybe a 10-inch one is big. These guys eat spiders and centipedes. That's what they feed on. And they're not doing well in the state, but they're still turning up at land between the lakes, which is where these came from. There's a juvenile is gray on the left, and an adult is kind of brownish.
That looks like a ringneck snake.
Well, it kind of does, but a ringneck snake is going to be slate gray all the way down with a yellow neck ring. And there are several young snakes that have a yellow neck ring. Red-bellied snake, decay snake, and crown snake, and ringneck. So just because it has a yellow ring around its neck doesn't make it a ringneck. There are no rules. That's kind of the rule. This is a species we may have lost already from Kentucky. It's our largest snake, northern pine snake. These things get 7 feet long. They'll rear up and hiss. It's the only snake other than a hognose that hisses in Kentucky. So these things, people kill these because they're afraid of them. But it's a really amazing snake. And if the Wildlife Restoration Act passes, we're going to work with the Louisville Zoo and set up a breeding population, because they have a couple of pine snakes that actually have Kentucky genetic material that came from western Kentucky. So we're going to try to establish a breeding colony and then try to restore these. This is one that was out at Murray State University. Ed Zimmerer had it in captivity. Some kid in Callaway County caught it, and Ed found out about it, and so he asked the kid if the kid would sell it to him. The kid wouldn't sell it to him. So Ed Zimmerer, who's retired now from Murray State, traded a bicycle for that pine snake, which is pretty cool. And he had it all summer, and he couldn't get it to eat anything. So he took it out where the kid had caught it and released it. And a few weeks later, Will Bird, the guy from the zoo, and Phil Peake, who with the Kentucky Herp Society, were in that same place. It's an old quarry, and they found that same pine snake. And they were all excited, and I said, "Oh, I think that's the same pine snake that Zimmer turned loose." And so we compared the markings on the head. I mean, it was the same snake. But Will and Phil got it to eat, and it fed on rats, and its genes are part of the breeding program that we're going to try to set up for northern pine snakes. And this is a pine snake hissing. It's a really loud hiss. And it's just like a musical instrument. It has this flap of skin right here. And when the snake, and this is the glottis, when the snake exhales, it vibrates that and produces a really loud hiss. and it's very impressive. I mean, it sounds a lot like a rattlesnake. But it's about as neat a snake as we have in Kentucky. And this kind of shows you what's happened to them. At one time, they were in eastern Kentucky, southeast, Mammoth Cave area. Now they're pretty much just in Trigg County and Callaway County in western Kentucky. One of my favorite snakes to look for is the Kirtland snake. It's a little relative of the water snake, real big Kirtland snake, maybe 16, 18 inches long. In Kentucky, it's pretty much an urban snake. This is where I caught my first Kirtland snakes in the state. Is right where that plastic is. These guys were replacing telephone poles in Louisville, and they dug a hole to put a telephone pole in, and they found 2 Kirtland snakes hibernating in a crayfish hole. So one of them called me, so I went over there, and so I laid out all kinds of paneling and stuff in an area about a mile radius around that, and we found a pretty good Kirtland snake population. So this is what they look like. Some of them are almost black and others are almost red. Kind of look like a garter snake, and they feed on earthworms. But they're really common in parts of Louisville. The one on the left came from Rumsey, Kentucky, when the Kentucky Fisheries Office used to be there. And David Bell was the fisheries biologist, and he was mowing the grass. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife, you not only get to be the biologist, you get to mow the grass. And there was a piece of gutter that had fallen off the building, and he lifted it up to move it, and it had that Kirtland snake under it. That's still the only one from McLean County. And I don't know how many afternoons we spent over there laying out stuff, looking under it, never found another one. And then the one on the right is from a population that was discovered in Graves County in far western Kentucky that actually lives in swampy habitat. And that's one that we found crossing the road one night. But that's a rare species. Cord snakes are two areas in the state, Mammoth Cave area, and they are pretty common there, from like Cave City all the way up almost to E-Town, 5 counties. And then there's a Red River Gorge population in eastern Kentucky, and they are almost gone. They were common there when I moved here in the early 70s. I don't know how many I found. I found 7 or 8 of them just in a few years, back when the Corps of Engineers had bought up a bunch of land to make the Red River Lake that they never made. And so there were all these abandoned houses. So I would just go around to abandoned houses and look for snakes. It was great. But now that's all been sold to the Forest Service, and they've all turned it all into recreation areas. They're all planted trees, so corn snakes are just not there anymore. But it's a really pretty snake, and there's a good population in Hart County, Grayson County, Barron, Edmonson. And that's the original one that I caught in the Red River Gorge in 1972. And had us as a pet for like 24 years. This is a snake that might be in Davis County. It's called a mud snake. Jet black with a red and black belly. Joe Ford had seen these in Richland Slough, which is in Henderson County, and then in a place around Sorville. And he couldn't remember exactly where, but so we still kind of consider that may have been in Davis County, but it probably isn't anymore. And the guy on the right is James Keisler, and he's a pretty good friend of mine, so it's hard to find friends when you want to go out looking for snakes all the time. So you hold on to the ones you find. 2 kinds of ribbon snakes that we have, and the eastern ribbon snake isn't doing too badly. I saw one of those today over at Slough's Wildlife area. The western ribbon snake has a really limited range, and it's doing pretty well also. But both of them they're uncommon as a whole. Kind of like a really skinny garter snake with a really long tail. This is the rarest Kentucky snake, Mississippi green water snake. As far as I know, these are two of the last three Mississippi green water snakes caught in Kentucky. So, one in 1983 and one in 2002. They're just in Wheelfoot Lake, and it's really hard to find them. And here are a couple of snakes that get, water snakes that get killed a lot because they kind of look like cottonmouths. Broadbanded is probably the prettiest water snake we have. And, the copperbelly on the right, I photographed off that boardwalk at Audubon State Park a few years ago. I was over there this afternoon and I saw one copperbelly, but I couldn't get any pictures of it. That's a good place to see him. And there's a copperbelly adult and a copperbelly juvenile. Cottonmouths are cool. Those of you that have seen them in the wild, I mean, there's nothing like a cottonmouth. And they always do that. If you surprise one on land, they throw that mouth open and the tail starts to vibrate and they spray musk straight up into the air. And it's a distinctive, foul smelling, I love the smell of cottonmouth musk. It's just, there's nothing like it, because that means you found a cottonmouth. But these are neat snakes. They're very common where they occur, but they're just in a few places in the state. The one on the right was Murphy's Pond in Hickman County. The one on the left was at Reelfoot. But the cottonmouth is unique in a lot of ways. It's the only snake that can stare at you when its head is pointed straight up. If you look at the one on the right, I mean, the way their eyes are kind of over, their head is concave on the sides. So when a cottonmouth sticks its head up or throws its mouth open, it can still see what's in front of it. It's a pretty amazing adaptation. I mean, you gotta really admire something like that. And these things, they're venomous and they're large, and I know they're dangerous, but I used to run around with this guy named Duke Wilder at Murray State, and he studied cottonmouths, and he had fences set up around Murphy's Pond, and when they came out of hibernation, they'd come down the hill and they'd encounter one of his fences and crawl along it and end up in a cage. And I was out there with him one time, and he said, these things won't bite you. And he takes a cottonmouth out of the cage and puts it down, and he puts his boot on it and rolls it around, and the cottonmouth is going, it didn't try to bite him. Now, I also had a friend who was killed by one in Louisiana when he fell on it, so, I mean, they can and will bite, but it's a pretty interesting snake. They're not really vicious. And people think of them as being all black, like the one on the right. That one was in Muhlenberg County.
Yes.
The one on the left is an adult also. Some of them are really colorful and can look like a copperhead or a water snake. You just have to kind of learn what a cottonmouth looks like if you're out in western Kentucky. And here's a juvenile. The juveniles look just like a baby copperhead, even with the yellow tail. Timber rattlesnakes are amazing. It always makes my day when I find a rattlesnake. And one day at Mammoth Cave, there was a girl doing point counts for birds at Mammoth Cave National Park, and she walked over this hill and found a rattlesnake. And so she was done for the day, and so she goes back to headquarters, and she told Bill Moore about it, who's a biologist who works there, and he called me. We went over there, and we went to where the girl found the rattlesnake, and we found 6 of them, and they were all pregnant.
Oh.
It was really cool. So this was it was in mid-August. So we went back in late September, and 4 of the 6, 3 of them had litters of young, and 1 was giving birth, and the other 2 were still pregnant. So we had a 30 timber rattlesnake day, with counting all the babies and the females. That was pretty neat. So that's my best timber rattlesnake day. But there's a lot of variation in these things. The one on the left is the prettiest timber rattlesnake picture I've ever seen. Phil Peak took that photo. And it's one at an area in Casey County where he's gotten permission from a property owner. He's been going there for like 20 years. And then the one on the right is kind of what you see in a lot of southeastern Kentucky. A lot of them are pretty dark. But I'm just going to show you some timber rattlesnakes. This is one I found on the road in Laurel County about 3 years ago, down by Cane Creek. And you walk up to them and they pretty much do nothing. And then when you get in their space, and that's about maybe from me to your shoe, then they'll kind of draw up a little bit. And if you stand there, then they'll try to crawl off the road. And if you go around and stand in front of them, they don't like it. So if you really make one mad, it'll curl up and start rattling at you. So when you make the timber rattlesnake rattle, you've done a bad thing. You've gotten in the space. So I try to not make them rattle, except for that one. I wanted pictures of him. So, and then this is one from Mammoth Cave. It was crossing the road down by the Green River Ferry. And something I noticed about rattlesnakes, the picture on the left was shot with natural light. The picture on the right, I had a flash on my camera and it's fill-in flash. But look how the flash changed the color of the rattlesnake. I think that's really cool. And here are two from western Kentucky in Lyon County. A lot of the western Kentucky rattlesnakes have a bright orange stripe down the back, and they're real pretty light gray color. Now, rattlesnake is it's the only Kentucky snake that actually takes care of its young. When the young are born, they stay with the female for about 10 or 11 or 12 days. And what you see here, when I lifted up the piece, this is a piece of tin at Mammoth Cave where I've been following a pregnant female. And so here's a litter of, I think there were 6 babies. And then the female was like way over on the right. Within less than a minute, all those babies crawled over there and crawled on the mom. And she did nothing. I mean, she just kind of sat there. But I knew better than to mess with them. Here's another female that had 11 babies. And when we first found them, they were all kind of in a group together, and then the females over there on the right. Almost instantly, they all started crawling toward her. And within just a very short time, every one of those babies is on top of the female. So it's pretty cool.
It's a beautiful snake.
Yeah, and I kind of think that timber rattlesnakes take better care of their young than some humans. And this is a really rare snake in the state, the pygmy rattlesnake. Only known from Trigg, southern part of LBL, and the corner of Callaway County. But we have not had a record from Trigg County in Kentucky in 20 years, so they're probably gone from the Trigg County part of LBL, but they're still showing up in Callaway. I think I found 3 of these in my life, and all on the same night, all crossing the same road. So.
Pygmy rattlers are fairly common around Titusville, Florida.
Yeah.
Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah, they're really abundant in Florida, which is pretty neat. But that's a different subspecies. What we have is the western pygmy, and they're kind of a glade rock outcrop species, not a swamp, edge of the road next to the swamp species. So they're pretty interesting. We don't know much about them. And this one, I photographed this one at the Owensboro Area Museum in 1975, the day I met Joe Ford. He had an aquarium, so that was pretty cool. Okay, I'm almost done. We have several rare lizards and turtles. I don't know whether you had race runners in this area or not. We found them in Hancock County 3 or 4 years ago. So they're pretty close. A race runner is a lizard, they're so fast that you're not sure whether you saw a lizard or not. Another name for them is a field streak. They're active midday when it's hot and sunny, constantly on the move, and when they see that you're anywhere near them, they just take off. Usually you hear them in the vegetation, and if you're really lucky, they'll slow down and start prowling again. And you can see
How
them.
big are those?
Well, tail and all is about like that, but the body, they're about the size of a skink. So,
I got an email from somebody the other day, it was a Facebook, I guess, and somebody said he had something that had lines on it, it was pretty long, and it was living under his porch.
okay, that would be a skink.
A skink?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Skinks are real shiny, but just glancing at them, they have
It had
stripes.
lines on it. Yeah.
And so there's a race runner shot in a gravel pit in the wild in Callaway County. It took me about 3 hours to get that picture. And that's the habitat. Gravel pits, eroded places where something went terribly wrong when they built a highway, places where the deer have tried to lick the minerals out of the soil, abandoned quarries. So I know of a couple of abandoned quarries in like Todd and Logan where you can go and find race runners. And we also have a legless lizard. It's called a glass lizard. Probably the name glass lizard is because if you try to pick one of these up, the tail breaks like with any lizard, and the thing breaks in half and the pieces thrash around. So I guess that's brittle like glass. These are pretty uncommon in the state. I used to find them at Mammoth Cave all the time, and when they did some prairie restoration there, I thought, oh, this will be really good for the glass lizards. Well, where they did the prairie restoration, the year before the restoration is the last time I ever saw glass lizards at those places. So maybe they did too much restoration. But these are really neat. If you're really careful, you can catch one and pick it up and not break the tail. But the way you do that is you get there about right at the crack of dawn when it's kind of chilly and they're sluggish, and you find them under a piece of tin or a board or something, and you can kind of gently pick them up. But boy, if you try to catch one at midday, it's going to get away from you. They're really fast. They do have an ear opening, so that's how you can tell it's not a snake. I don't know if you can see it because it's well disguised, but it's right there on that one. And they also have eyelids. And they have a thick pink tongue. But, a lot of people think they're snakes. So they get killed. They get killed because they look like a snake. And this is kind of gives you an idea of how they're doing in the state. Not real well. But we still have a couple of places where we can find them. This was a coal skink, which is, I think in Barber's book, I think he had seen one coal skink in his life, and it was at Robinson Forest in eastern Kentucky. This one, Joe Settles with East Kentucky Power, they were doing a workshop for kids on amphibians and reptiles, and they were turning over rocks, and he catches a coal skink. That's the only one from that part of the state. So, but I did find a pretty good site for these in Callaway where I can go and find them. So here are a couple of pregnant coal skinks. Coal skinks lay eggs really early in the year. Most skinks lay eggs in mid to late June. Coal skinks lay eggs sometimes late April, early May. So I don't know why, but it's neat. So there's a female with eggs, and then the hatchlings are like a hatchling 5-line skink has got white stripes on it and a blue tail. The hatchling coal skink is almost black. So pretty neat skink. And this is a southeastern 5-line skink, which is, I think that's my favorite lizard in the state. People have trouble identifying them, but I figured out if you look at the back of the head, the stripe on the body, there's a gap between the stripe in the body and the stripes on the head. and it's real distinctive. And I don't know why no one's ever picked up on that, but it's a real good character. So if you ever find a skink, try to get a picture of its head. And this is southeastern historic then and now. Mud turtles. Mud turtles are great. Probably my favorite turtle. I mean, they're small, they kind of look like a little army helmet. They are extremely vicious. And I had a mud turtle in an aquarium, and I had an alligator snapper that was twice as big as the mud turtle in the adjacent aquarium. And one of my wife's cats got down in the basement and got over on my side, and I had a piece of wood that was laid up behind the aquarium. The cat walked on the piece of wood and knocked it down into the mud turtle aquarium. And the mud turtle climbed up the piece of wood, and when it got up to the top, it flipped over like a teeter-totter, and the mud turtle went into the alligator snapper aquarium. And I come down the next day, and there's nothing left of my alligator snapper, except a little bit of the shell. The mud turtle had killed it and eaten it. I was pretty impressed. Dang. It's like David and Goliath. I do get calls from people who say, we have turtles in our lake that have white eyes. You know, is that unusual? Well, it kind of is, but that means they probably have Mississippi map turtles. These are in western Kentucky, and they do have white eyes. They're in like Lake Barkley, Kentucky Lake, and Lower Ohio, Mississippi rivers. And you can find these at basking on logs. The one on the right is actually, it's a captive at Kentucky Danville State Park. So they have a sign that says, meet our map turtles. And neither one of them's a map turtle. One's a Washita map, the other's the Mississippi map. But you can't tell state parks anything. And these are two more Mississippi maps. I had that crescent that goes down under the eye and white eyes. Really neat looking turtles. And here's one basking. If you ever get out in Fulton County, in far western Kentucky, there's a place called Hamby Pond, and it has a gravel road next to it. It's privately owned, but it's a public fishing area, and that's where you can go and photograph turtles basking. It's a really good place. And this is a false map turtle, which is pretty similar to a Mississippi, but it has brown eyes instead of white eyes. Pretty rare. Southern painted turtle in Kentucky. These are just in Fulton County. They used to be a subspecies of the painted turtle that's around here, but the researchers got a hold of them and decided that southern painted is a separate species. So when I was studying painted turtles in the 80s, we have things that look like that all the way up into Ballard County and all the way through the Jackson Purchase into Kentucky Lake. And I just called them all intermediates. But now, I don't know what they are. So I think they're hybrids, but we don't really know that for sure, so we're gonna have to do some genetic work. But there's a place called Running Slough in Fulton County. You can stand on the bridge over Running Slough and photograph southern painted turtles, which is pretty cool. And there's a southern painted turtle and a red-eared. Just red-eared sliders get really huge, and that's a little baby southern painted photographed off the bridge. And that's what one looks like when you catch him. Smooth softshell and spiny softshell. Davis County probably has smooth softshells. They are in the Ohio River. They live in fine sand. They occur, there are a few of them in the Louisville area, and they occur all the way into eastern Kentucky in the Ohio River, usually right below the dams where there are big sandbars. The spiny softshell, which is the one on the right, is, you can identify it because it has a pattern on the feet, and if you look at its nostrils, it has a little ridge projecting off the nasal septum, And a smooth soft shell has completely round nostrils. So, but the main way to tell them is if you grab it and it bites you, it's a spiny. And they have, they're kind of flabby looking, they have a flappy shell, kind of like a big pancake, but they have jaws that are really strong. And I've seen them bite fish in half. So you don't want to mess with the spiny soft shell, but the spiny soft shell would be what you'd see in like Panther Creek. They can tolerate mud, gravel, rocks. They live in ponds sometimes, but a smooth soft shell requires that fine sand. And so that's an adult smooth soft shell. The smooth comes from the fact they don't have any tubercles on the shell. And a few years ago, well, mid-'80s, we were out along the Mississippi River, and Doug Stevens, who was a fisheries biologist, Doug Stevens can find anything. I mean, he is good. And he says, look at that funny looking place in the sand. I bet there's a smooth soft shell nest there. And we go, yeah, right. So Doug goes over, and he digs with his hands, and he finds a smooth soft shell nest. This is in August. These things lay eggs in May and June. It was under that much sand. Who knows how many times it had rained since then? But Doug, he dug in 3 places where he thought there were nests, and he found eggs in all 3 places. So anyway, a few years ago, I wanted to have, I needed a better pictures of the smooth soft shell. So we have the guys that do the least turn surveys on the Mississippi River. So I asked them if they found a nesting smooth soft shell, if they could get me, a half dozen eggs or so. So a couple of days later, they called up and they had found a nesting smooth soft shell, and they got me 5 eggs. So they gave me this 5-gallon bucket of Mississippi River sand with these 5 eggs, and I hatched them out. And so that's a little baby smooth soft shell. That's what I hatched. So that was pretty cool. My wife loves these guys. They live on the kitchen counter. And they're getting good size. We really need to let them go. How do you take a soft shell turtle away from your wife? So anyway, so the one on the right is one of the ones.
You watch out for the jaws.
Well, they're not the ones that bite. Now she has raised spiny soft shells. I found a spiny soft shell under a bridge. Half of its shell had been scraped away, probably by a raccoon or something. I thought it was dead, and I was going to pickle it, but it was still alive. So I brought it home. My wife nursed it back to health, and it now lives in the Salado Center on display, and it's about that big. Almost all the turtles in the Salado Center started out on our kitchen. And my wife loves rehabilitating turtles. So I guess that's a pretty good thing, And so my last species here is an alligator snapping turtle. We have 13 records of these in the state. The only one I ever found was a skeleton embedded in the mud at Laketon, but I count that anyway, in Carlisle County. It's one of our 13 records. But the thing on the left, it was dug from Big Springs Park in Princeton. And it had made its way out of Lake Barkley, followed this creek, and it was hibernating in the gravel at the entrance where the water comes out of Big Spring. And people were cleaning out, the parks people were cleaning out the spring and found it. So they threw it in a pickup truck and took a picture of it, and then they followed the creek down, turned it back loose in Lake Barkley. But that was pretty cool. The one on the right was well over 100 pounds, and it had drowned on a bank line that some fishermen had left. It was in the Blood River drainage in Callaway County, and I'm trying to remember the name of there was a famous birder who found it. I can't believe I can't remember her name. Anyway, some friend of Brainerd. So they're canoeing down this slough near Kentucky Lake, and there were all these vultures on something out in the water, and it was, see, is there a Easley, is that name?
Melissa, yeah. Melissa.
Yeah, okay, that's who it was. So anyway, so I was really lucky, she took some pictures of it after the vultures scattered. So that's our Callaway County record of an alligator snapper. And so Floyd Scott at Austin P went back up there and he found a couple of pieces of the shell. So there's now a specimen that's a couple of pieces of shell from that turtle. This is one that I had in captivity in the 80s for a couple of years. We were out at Ballard Wildlife Area, and this was back when bald eagles were really rare in the state, and we would go down there and do winter eagle counts several times a year. And so I'm down staying in Paducah, and I get this call from my friend Danny Scott, who lived at Reelfoot Lake, and he said there was a 40-pound alligator snapping turtle in a meat market in Tiptonville, Tennessee, and they wanted 50 cents a pound for it. And it was alive. So I made a beeline for Tiptonville, Tennessee. So for $20, I got this 40-pound alligator snapping turtle, which I kept through the winter, and I couldn't get it to eat fish, but it ate red-eared sliders. And I didn't really want to feed it turtles, that's just wrong. So when the weather got warm, I was going to release it back in western Kentucky, but Land Between the Lakes asked if they could have it. So it was the big alligator snapper that was at the Nature Center at Land Between the Lakes for 20, 25 years, and then it finally passed away. So its shell is now on display at the...
How big do they get?
They get well over 100 pounds.
When, at one point, I don't know when this was, but there was a place in southern Illinois that had a little restaurant on the river. It was south of Carbondale, over on the riverside. And there was a newspaper clipping, and they said there's a pen down the street. You can see this turtle weighs 200 pounds. We went down there, and it was huge. And it looked just like that, only it was about like this, and the head was the width of the shell.
Yeah.
It was just huge.
That turtle had a head that big.
Yeah, but well, this thing is, I mean, the head was like this.
Yeah.
And it was a gigantic thing. I didn't realize they got that big. It was really ugly.
Chester, Illinois, wasn't it?
Huh?
Chester, Illinois?
Yes. Ma Hale's Restaurant was the name of the place. I couldn't remember it. Chester was the place.
1967.
Yeah, and there was an alligator that they had caught in the river somewhere, about 6 feet long, and they had both of them in this pen.
I think the alligator's lucky.
Yeah.
Because I know what this thing did to red-eared sliders, was not pleasant.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be nothing left of a full-grown red-eared slider.
I don't remember if they had them separated or if they were together, but they were both in the same general location.
But when I had that thing, and Jeff Soule, one of our biologists, brought his, he brought an old bathtub in. They'd gotten a new bathtub, so we had it in the fish lab in a bathtub, which it couldn't get out of the bathtub normally, but it learned how to claw the stopper out of the bottom, and then it would let all the water out, and then it could get out. So we'd come in Monday morning, and there'd be water all over the floor down in the basement of the fish lab, and the alligator snapper would be gone, and it would go into the library, and it would try to get behind the books on the lower shelves, so you could always find it, just where the books are. So you'd pick it up, take it back, and put it in the bathtub and fill it up again. That gets really old, so that's another reason why I took it out to Land Between the Lakes. But really neat turtles. The one on the right is the hatchling that I had, and it was about a year old when my mud turtle ate it. So that's the only picture of it I have. But the alligator snapper has a tongue that looks like an earthworm, and they use it as a lure, and they'll be in a mucky, muddy water with that mouth open, and they wiggle that tongue, and it attracts fish. So.
There was a place across the river. I was a psychologist, and I saw this teenager kid in Rockport, and he told me that he had a glove, a chainmail glove, it would go up like this, And they used to go turtling under the,
Yeah, noodling. Yeah, you reach under the tree roots.
up under the banks of the little ponds, I guess.
Yeah,
And they get up there and the thing would latch onto his chainmail, but it didn't cut his hand off. Yeah. I didn't realize there were so many around, but apparently over there are. I don't
I
know.
used to have a friend, UK used to do in their cancer research lab, they work with rats. And so a friend of mine worked in the rat facility at UK. And so every week they would have extra rats. And so I would go and I would get baby rats to feed to my snakes, you know, for free from the cancer research lab. But he grew up in Wolfe County at a children's home, and he spent his whole life from the time he was a kid noodling snapping turtles. So I went out with him one time and we walked up this little creek in Fayette County that, I mean, it had creek chubs in it, you know. And I said, well, we're not gonna find any turtles here. And just about every sycamore tree, he'd reach up under there and feel around and he'd pull out a snapping turtle. And I mean, they were 10, 15 pounds.
Yeah.
I mean, and he said he'd done it his whole life. And I said, how can you just reach up in there and how do you know it's not gonna bite you? He said, well, he said, usually they go in, they're active at night and they go in when it starts to get light and they'll be head in. And then they don't turn around usually until it's almost dark. So if you go in the morning, early afternoon, you reach in there and you know, you can tell immediately whether you're touching the back end or the front end because the spine's on the shell and the tail. So he said if you don't feel that, you jerk your hand out of there really quick. But I was truly impressed. You know, some of these guys really know what they're doing.
The technique.
Yeah, great technique. So I made a list of the species on our rare list known from Davis County. And I just threw that in there. So crawfish frog is probably not here anymore. Lesser siren and Midland mud salamander maybe, just based on what Joe Ford told me. And you know, and that was sometime in maybe the early 2000s when he told me about that. And, reptiles, quite a few. Cottonmouths at Crane Pond, and ribbon snakes, copperbellies, and mud turtles are fairly common in the county. Probably have smooth soft shells in the Ohio River and probably Mississippi maps. But those are things to be thinking about, you know, when you're birding. Don't step on that smooth soft shell. And then I got photos from 3 people. Bill Peake's timber rattlesnake, Todd McKinney's crawfish frog is calling, and Will Bird's scarlet king snake hatching. All the other photos are mine, but then these are some of the people that I've worked with a lot over the years, and they've helped me find a lot of stuff. So I wanted to give some of them credit. I can't give him all credit. I did put the junior after Brainerd's name. I figured if he ever saw this, he'd probably get upset if I didn't. But that's all I got. So I probably took way too long. I'll be glad to stay here as long as you don't want. If you have any questions.